Hi there, my name's Lockie. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer and it's great to have you with us. In this video, we're going to talk about how to use sensitivity labels and encryption in Microsoft Purview. The video is going to cover a few important areas. First, we'll look at how we configure sensitivity labels, the primary way in which we enforce sensitivity in Microsoft Purview. We'll talk a bit about the management of the labels themselves, and then we'll have a secondary section on encryption, both in terms of message encryption and broader encryption practices across the Purview stack. When you look at the information protection framework, the things that we'll be discussing today are all part of the Protect Your Data component of the framework itself. Now, labels can be configured to do quite a few things, but the two that we're focused on are encryption and access controls. These give us mechanisms to be able to control the flow of data and to be able to say things like only members of finance can open this file. For more information on the way in which the information protection framework can assist you, head on over to Microsoft Learn to learn more. All right, let's get ourselves started with our first major topic here. How we actually go through and create and configure all of our sensitivity labels within Purview. There's a few things that I want to make sure that we cover as part of this first topic. Of course, the creation of the labels themselves, how to publish them out, how to use them to classify data, those sorts of things. We'll also talk encryption and a little bit of auto-labeling that come into it as well. Not all labels have to be applied automatically, but there is quite a lot that you can do in a fairly automated fashion. Also talk a little bit about the dashboard that's available to you to monitor how sensitivity labels are being utilized and so you can track it over time. Now, since they are such a core and fundamental piece of what we're doing, we should probably talk about sensitivity labels. Now, sensitivity labels are the main and primary mechanism we have for actually classifying and therefore protecting data. Think of it as a metadata tag that we can apply to files, apps, devices, services, essentially anything within the M365 system. Now, there's a number of things that we can achieve with this, but the two main ones that most people are interested in are the ability to choose encryption standards, where we need the ability to either control using Azure Rights Management or the ability to add additional encryption for compliance reasons, or where we want to add some sort of marker to a document. This can come in the forms of headers or footers that say a classification of a file, or it can be in the form of watermarks that we apply, or even metadata stamps. There's a lot of different reasons that we may apply it, but ultimately, once we've got these baseline protection points in, we can also start to additionally control based on the label. Rather than having to work out if this particular Excel file has this particular type of data, we can say broadly, financial data should be categorized with the financial label, and therefore certain restrictions around who can access it, certain enforcements around where it can be accessed, and how that data should be available, they can be enforced at that broader label level. Labels themselves do have a few use case subsegments within them. For example, label groups allow us to be able to create one broad category, say general, with subgroups, so external or internal only. So we can have multiple different levels of classification and give our users quite a bit of nuance. Of course, labels can be applied automatically, and we'll take a look at a little bit of that, but we should probably talk about the creation of the labels themselves. Now, when we go through and we create labels and label groups, there is a clear pattern that we need to follow. First of all, if you are going to be using the subgroup segment, so that general with internal and external inbuilt, we need to make sure we create that label group as our first step. You'll define a classification name and a general description, and then we can start to add sublabels within it. Labels can also be created without a label group, in which case we can go straight to the configuration of the protection options themselves. This can come in the form of encryption, rights management, access restrictions, or that content marking managed before. When we go through and we actually apply these different labels, it then becomes how do we actually want to start enforcing it? So let's work through those bit by bit. Whether we're enforcing, making mandatory or default, or just rolling them out, what are some of these controls that we have? We'll start with a bit of baseline encryption. So when we configure encryption, there's a few different approaches we can take. We can either assign the permissions directly. This essentially allows you to have the permissions assigned anytime this label's in place, Or we can let users assign the permissions. Think about this more of a when a file is available to the finance team, if they identify that some piece of sensitive financial information is there, they can apply the label themselves. Regardless of how the label gets applied, encryption can then be layered atop. Now, the encryption will stay with that file or email, even if it moves into other areas of the organization. All it needs is the correct label or policy applied. This is done through Azure RMS, the rights management component. When we use rights management here, essentially, it's encryption-based that is focused at an identity layer. Someone has to sign in, prove they should have access to this file before we're allowed to actually let them go through into the next stage. Now, there is different pieces to this puzzle. Of course, we are going to need to roll these out in some sort of policy-based structure, and we're going to need to think about what users we actually want to have this label applied, or at least the ability for them to apply this to documents, emails, etc. But we can also make that an automated suite. Auto-labeling is available anytime you want to go through and reduce the reliance on someone essentially checking the work. If you wish to do an auto-label, there's two different approaches. We can either have a client-side auto-labeling, i.e. when someone is going through and editing a file, that's when the label gets applied as it gets checked, or at rest, we can scan data that is located in SharePoint, OneDrive, or Exchange. There's no wrong approach to this, but there is some important things you need to think about. As you define this, one of the extra pieces that you will need to really consider is the fact that you're going to need to have sensitive information types, essentially a pattern match or a classifier, that allows you to identify when something should be labeled automatically. It's a much larger scope to be able to complete something in an auto-labeling fashion than it is to complete it in a manual labeling fashion. Additionally, there is a simulation mode available when you go through and you apply the auto-labeling. It's recommended to test this out with real users, typically a subset of them, just to make sure that things are going to work well in the way that they need to. For best practices, start with high-impact labels, things that are your most sensitive and clearly delineated types of information, and then scroll back through there. Now, no matter whether it is automatically applied or manually applied, no matter the conditions you place on it, there is a clear administrative pathway that you need to follow around the lifecycle management of the labels themselves. Sensitivity labels over time may be replaced, updated, or simply just require retirement. So I'll talk through some strategies on what the lifecycle looks like, how to actually recognize when a label is being put in place and how to make it consistent across all of M365 and beyond, and how to identify when something does require retirement or refinement more broadly. There is a process assigned to it, and there is some steps that you'll need to take, especially when we're uplifting to a new sensitivity label type. Now, you may be wondering, at what point would I ever go through and retire a sensitivity label? But it does happen all the time, especially within governmental work and within a number of other high compliance areas. Often, governmental bodies or industry bodies will change some of the labeling strategies we use or even the categories that they're applied. But we want to ensure that when we uplift from one label type to another, or we remove a label type from our environment, things still stay categorized correctly. The worst thing would be to have a highly confidential piece of information suddenly become unlabeled, essentially orphaned. It means that we don't have the protections in place that we want. So we need to think of it as either a migration process or essentially a retirement process more broadly. Now, we start with the creation of the label itself. The configuring has a lot of steps within it around ensuring the right protections are in place, the right markings are there, all of those sorts of things. Then we publish the label accordingly. These two steps we've followed so far. But the third thing we need to focus on is the analysis and refinement. This is not a one and done. Labels take time to adjust to make sure that they work functionally. Once we have gone through and we've defined our label, you will adjust that configuration over time to make sure the right things are matched, to make sure it applies in the right way, and as new labels are introduced, that things are caught accordingly. And at some point, the retirement needs to be considered. Just like our data estate itself, we need to work out when we remove a label from active use, but without going through and disrupting protection broadly. Now, the labeling strategy starts with a simple place of starting with the defaults. Microsoft does actually provide defaults in our labels to give you a baseline. If you have another baseline you need to follow, though, it's well within your remit to change these or adjust them to your own requirements. It's also good to note that labels don't have to be applied to individual files, folders, emails, that sort of thing directly. It can be a good, consistent strategy to instead applying them to an ecosystem, large amounts of SharePoint as an example. And of course, auto-labeling, it can be tempting to apply, but maybe it's better to have a reasonable default policy as a baseline label, and then only use auto-labeling for highly sensitive information. This gives a bit more flexibility in terms of where we want users selecting certain things. Speaking of which, training is required as part of this. When you are building out a secure by default training strategy around labeling, you need to actually build and perform that training for users. Give them guidance on what labels should be used for what purpose. This is especially important if we are following the life cycle, we are removing or replacing labels over time. You need to make sure that users are educated on the new labels, the structures, all of the things that come into play. Now, when we do come to the point where we need to go through and remove a label from our environment, the simple answer is you won't remove that label immediately. A retirement of a label does not mean an immediate removal. In fact, when a label is removed from the user's UI, typically the content itself still has the same label and protections in the backend. Then over time, we will catalog what labels are actually available to us, where we have seen adjustments, and we will ensure that whilst it's not used for new assignments, we can actually still keep policies running and then migrate those across to a different label structure. For example, if you have a high compliance label with only that one piece of nuance, and instead you choose to recategorize that to high compliance, internal or external with a subcategory, what is going to be your policy for migrating those labels across? Documents, files, emails, etc. that are caught under the original label practice will need to be moved across with updated scopes applied to the new label. Over time, auto-labeling rules will need to be adjusted, and we'll need to ensure that essentially we remove that label through the process of attrition. This is something that will take time, so make sure that you are thinking about how you're going to perform this migration. You want to ensure that users see the simplest set for them to be able to achieve what they need in their day. The more complexity we add, the more difficult it is for a user to identify and correctly categorize information. So ensure that things remain protected even amidst migration, and relabel the content over time. That is still the best strategy when we are looking to retire something at the end of its life cycle. All right, now, let's go through and we'll take a look at Purview's portal itself, and we're going to set up a few different things. We'll take a look at how sensitivities labels work across a number of different areas, including parent and sub-labels, and also talk a little bit about how auto-labeling functions. Let's get started. Okay, so now we're over in the Microsoft Purview portal. Now, before we go diving through our Solutions tab and heading into our various information protection settings, there is a couple of things that we actually need to adjust. So we're going to go down into our settings and confirm a couple of important things. Critically, the one that we need to make sure is put in place over in information protection is our co-authoring for sensitivity labeled documents. Now, if this setting is not enabled in your environment, users effectively won't be able to collaborate in the way that they would expect with modern Office tooling if it is labeled with a sensitivity label. Make sure that's turned on, hit apply, and put in place. If you do see any issues with this, there is also a PowerShell methodology to go through and enable this. All right, now we've done our baseline work, we can actually go through and start the process of creating our sensitivity labels directly. we're going to go across through into the Solutions tab and open up Sensitivity Labels to get a bit more information to get ourselves started. This is part of the broader information protection suite. All right, now with our sensitivity labels brought up, we will go through and we can start to take a look at some of the ones that have been built into the stack here. So out of the box, we have some low priority numbers. Typically, the smaller the number, generally speaking, the one that is going to be of a less sensitivity level. That's not a unique and only way to do it, but it is a pretty common approach that we see. As we scroll through, we can see things like personal, public, general, confidential, highly confidential. These all represent general structure ones, as well as some custom labels such as confidential for finance and one for a specific project located down the bottom. We can reorder these if we need to, which will change the user experience and change what gets shown to them directly. But the key thing to note is that the default labels are, in fact, sometimes a label group. We have a number of different ones here. Confidential is one of the ones that we're taking a look at, and you can see within it we have anyone unrestricted, all employees, and trusted people. Effectively, these sub-labels within a label group give you a bit more flexibility about choosing a broad category and then giving some sort of subcategory that focuses on maybe a subset of data or a specific set of users that should be able to access information. Now, if we're ready to go through and create our own label group, all we need to do is do exactly that. There's a Create tab at the top of the page, and when we select that, we can either create a label itself. Labels don't have to be a part of a group directly, but as we see here, but we can instead go through and make sure that they are effectively going to be a subgroup. So we'll go through and we'll hit Create and get ourselves a new label group for internal documentation. Now, as you're putting this through, you will of course require both a name and a display name. These are exactly as it sounds. The name is for essentially your administrators, whereas the display name is for end users. Also note that it's a description for admins and a description for users separately. We can't change the label group priority as of this second. You do that after the label has been created. Last of all, down the bottom, there is a label group color. This keeps it easy to understand from a user perspective what classification you have assigned. Note that there is a limited number of colors, so make sure you pick and choose these accordingly for scenarios where you think it is important to have that visual identifier for the users there. All right, now that we have created the group itself, we're going to go through and create a label within it. I'm going to select Don't Create a Label. I want to show you what to do when you're actually presented with the broad UI here. All right, now we've got our different labels and the different sub-labels here. We can scroll on further down and we'll be able to create something with a similar sort of hierarchy where we can create those different sub-labels within the broader label group. Our internal group is down the bottom. There is no breakout right now because we don't have any additional labels created within it. It's currently the lowest priority, effectively the bottom of the list, and that means at this current moment we would effectively be saying that it is the most important. Note that when I go to create a label, unless I have actually gone through the process of selecting the group and stating I want it as a sub-label, there is no hierarchy here. We can't create the label directly in that group. So I'm going to hit cancel and I'm going to instead go through, select the internal one, and we'll create the label directly within it as a sub-label. Here in the actions, we can create that label in the group, and on the page that loads up, you'll see parent label internal. This is important to note if you do want to create things within this hierarchical setup. Next, we just need to give it a quick name. Since we're looking at different types of internal data here, we're going to create one for employee data related to HR. Note the difference in the description for users, which is focused on, it's a HR label for labeling documents related to the HR department, versus the description for admins, which is do not change this label unless you have consulted Mrs. Jones, the head of HR. This is an important piece of the puzzle where you are able to put in additional reference information that's only important to administrators. Next, we need to choose where this is going to apply. Now, out of the box, files, emails, meetings. These are the three primary places that we can define sensitivity scopes. If you are looking to just label file and data assets, simply unselect the ones that you are not interested in. For example, meetings here. But we're still going to continue with this one and label our files and our emails accordingly. Once we have decided what we're picking, we'll select next, and then we can choose the protection settings, kind of like what we actually want to have happen here. So the protection settings allow us to state what needs to happen next. Do we control access to see who can and cannot view these files accordingly? Do we want to apply any dynamic markings or watermarks to any files accordingly? And of course, if we selected meetings, we have the ability to configure that too. Note we now have a flyer based on the suggestions that we actually picked. So working our way through, first of all, we need to assign the permissions directly, and we can choose if user access expires to content after some specific date. This is great for temporary access to projects or where we're looking to enroll people in for a contracting period. Offline access is essentially the same thing, but if we can't synchronize with the online service, this gives users a certain amount of time where they can still access the file before the synchronization needs to happen again. You can set this to whatever you need to make it work accordingly. Now, we will need to go through and assign permissions to make sure that this is applying to some subset of users, but note that many of the permission assignments are actually very broad. Essentially, any authenticated user means anyone who uses an Entra ID or a Microsoft account or a federated social account or someone who's using a one-time passcode. If they have passed a check with Entra ID, we can apply this enforcement to them. Now, there's plenty of other mechanisms that would prevent a user from coming in if we don't otherwise see them. And note that this doesn't have to be this broad. We can be very specific down to individual emails or domains for allowing or denying access. Next, we see a couple of options down the bottom, dynamic watermarking and double key encryption. We'll take a look at these in a bit more depth in a little while, but dynamic watermarking is going to be an interesting one to look at. This means that if a file is downloaded, we can actually apply something that shows who downloaded the file and who opened and accessed it. It's like a way to identify a user even on the physical document. Next, we're going to jump into our content marking, and I want to add a couple of individual pieces in here related to the fact that this is a finance document. First, we're going to go through and set a couple of things up around the way that we want this to be marked. So internal use only in big red text, maybe not quite that big, but that's all right. We've got something pretty large that's going to be very obvious that this is internal use only. This diagonal watermark goes on the back, and then we can set custom headers and footers. If you do want to use something that is a little bit more focused on the dynamic component, that's where we'd use the dynamic watermarking instead. Consider this as something that anytime the label is applied, this would be a static piece of content that is added into the document or the email. Once we've configured these pieces out, we can now start to choose when this should apply. Auto-labeling is available within this scenario, and all we need to do is target a certain sensitive information type to ensure that we're able to actually target it accordingly. If you can provide us a condition as to when a file should be matched, we can provide the auto-labeling capability. For now, I'm going to turn this one off, and we're going to consider this a manual label that someone in finance can apply themselves. With that, we'll submit, and we'll get our label put in place. All right, with this now in, we're nearly ready to go. There is a couple of other hoops that we're going to need to jump through to ensure that, well, it's available to the users directly. And the next main one is to publish the label out. You can have labels working in the background, but aren't available to users in Office applications. Publishing a label is the thing that will actually go through and circle it out and surface it to the users directly. So when we hit Publish Label, we'll be able to select what sensitivity label we wish to actually present to users. Of course, admin units are still available if we only want to present this to a portion of the business, and we can instead achieve this by selecting certain users and groups if we want to instead. I selected the thing that I'm looking to target. In this case, it's our new employee data HR tag, and we'll just go through and we'll select Next. We'll skip past the admin units here, and then we'll jump straight across into some of our settings, because there is a couple of additional adjustments you can make as needed. All right, targeting all users and groups here, Note that we can specify specific users if we wanted to. In our case, we could maybe go through and specify just the finance team. We can select Next, and we can start targeting a few additional controls. First of all, will we allow users to remove a label or reduce its classification in the priority list? If we want to allow for that, we can with justification. We also have abilities to prevent this if we need to. Outside of that, we've got the ability to choose when users are able to apply labels to emails and documents. Great if you're sharing outside to other organizations, and additional controls around Power BI, Fabric, and if we want to provide a link to a specialized help page that you have designed. All of these controls are available if required. Consider them optional based on your particular requirements. Now, as a last port of call, we also have the ability to choose things like default labeling. So when someone creates a document for the first time in your organization, what's the label that should be applied? This might be different for certain teams, but in general, we may want to have one broad label that applies to all documents, say confidential general or something along those lines, and then we can adjust it accordingly as we need to. Last of all, put some details in for the policy name. This is effectively just going to say what labels are being published under what conditions, and this is specifically internal HR employee data. Provide a quick description, and then publish this one out. This will be the thing that then surfaces this in integrated applications within the M365 stack, like Office. Note that the policy can take up to 24 hours to actually roll out to all of the different user applications. So plan in advance to make sure that this is all going to be done right when you need it. Now, I'm going to go through and create one more type of label here. And we're actually going to create something using some of the advanced label settings that we have available. There's a couple of interesting adjustments I want to put in place. Things like the ability to do dynamic watermarking, and I also want to look at that double key encryption option. So let's set up a scenario where we would need to apply those within the internal structure. I'll select my actions and create a label within the group. And we're going to create one focused on the finance team specifically. I mentioned them a couple of times at this point, and they tend to have more restrictions on them than other teams in an organization. I'll select financial data as the name with a quick description of what is designed here, and a general description for users to let them know why this is in place. Note that in the description for admins, there is also a little bit that is focusing on the fact that it includes sensitive financial identifiers. So we're going to be utilizing sensitive information types to be able to achieve some of the dynamic marking that we need here. I'm not going to do any major selections at this point. We're going to just continue along and focus on the auto tagging based on the requirements that we need to put in place. We'll select auto label, and so as things are found that match this criteria, we can essentially apply the label automatically to it. Now, there's a few different things that I think we should apply here that will be relevant to the financial team. So let's go through and apply them now, and I'll be back in 2 ticks once we select them. All right, we now have 3 sensitive info types, all with different confidence levels applied as part of this structure. So if we detect SWIFT codes, routing numbers, or credit card numbers, we'll be able to automatically tag the content as part of this financial tag. Of course, this will be dependent on scope and where we choose to apply this auto apply as well. So there's still some more conditions that will allow us to ensure this doesn't go too far or in areas of unintended consequence. Now, we need to now choose what happens when this actually applies. And we can choose to either automatically apply the label or present a tooltip to the user. This one's great. So if you are in an organization where it is common to share some of this information, in fact, it's normal within the practice of business, you can instead have a recommendation that users apply the label, maybe if with a note to say that only when we share externally, or even some adjustments in terms of their behavioral characteristics. So use this as a way to shape behavior over time, and think about the different ways in which you can apply these different labeling components and choose when they need to be published out so users can still apply them manually as required. All right, so let's go create one last label in this group that is focused around a scenario where double key encryption is going to be relevant to us, a legal team. When we work with legal scenarios, especially in high compliance areas, there are often reasons that we may need to utilize a customer managed key, which is essentially an additional layer of encryption atop what we are typically doing as Microsoft at rest in general for all of our customers. I'm going to apply this just to our files and our meetings. And we're going to use this to be able to set up a couple of things around the way that access control will work for our users in our legal team. Let's start with the access control and move on from there. Next, I'll go through and we're going to set a couple of easy permissions around who this should apply to. Effectively, I only want to apply this to the legal team, but I will also apply this to a test user just to make sure that when certain actions happen, we can verify without necessarily having to involve real legal documents, at least at a starting point. So let's get everyone added and we'll be back in 2 ticks. All right, now with both a test user and the legal team added in, we can also choose if we need to do any additional components around auto-labeling, etc. Now, for our purposes, we are specifically interested in just some critical components about the mechanisms of the scope. So let's jump back there. We've got our files and emails, and I want to apply some content markings as well. Here we are. So I want to go through and ensure that we apply some of our different content markings. Now, the ones I am interested in are the dynamic ones, not necessarily the ones where we manually place them. So we're going to go through and select both of these. First, dynamic watermarking. This allows us to tag documents with a user's email, the UPN that they have, as well as any other additional information around a timestamp. Effectively, the document will be stamped when they open it, so even if they print it or attempt to share it, we will have a very clear moment in line where we know who shared it when. Additionally, the double key encryption is also enabled here. Please note that DKE is not just an easy setup. There is quite a number of steps you will need to follow to make sure that keys are accessible to Microsoft, stored in Azure, all of the right different steps that go into play. When you're on this page, you can hit the Learn More button to jump over to learn.microsoft.com to get that information, or you can view more information by simply searching for double key encryption and Purview. Now with all of the settings set up, we can simply hit go. We'll create our label, we'll get all our last pieces in place, and we will have all of the information required to get ourselves done. All right, we now have a few different internal labels created, and we've got most of the things we need to get going to get ourselves essentially set up for our highly confidential scenarios. All right, now I've moved across to the Defender XDR portal here. Defender XDR still has a couple of capabilities where we can integrate within labels and broader structures within the sort of stuff that we've been talking about. So let's go through and set things up. There will be a couple of settings that we actually need to configure before we do anything else though. So let's head in now and get those done. I'll open up our settings tab here, and then we're going to jump into Cloud Apps. The specific integration we're going to be leveraging is the Defender for Cloud Apps integration with information protection. So we just need to go through and make sure all of the settings are in place before we go and create any policies. First of all, we'll scroll on down and select Information Protection. Now, within the Microsoft Information Protection submenu, there's 2 critical settings which we can enable. The first setting is going to be focused around what we scan. Essentially, are we looking to apply sensitivity labels in the context here? Note the phrase scan new files. So this is interested in using inspection more broadly to go through scan new files as they're created and then try and apply sensitivity labels that are appropriate. The secondary is focused on scanning files where the inspection warnings only happen in this tenant. Now, that second piece of nuance in this tenant is extremely important as well. If you are sharing documents between different organizations, you may not want to apply additional scans to documents coming from other orgs. You may want to instead retain their particular sensitivity label. Both of these settings are up to you, but there is more information available over on Microsoft Learn, so you can decide as an org what's going to be the best way to work out this integration. I'll hit save on this one here, and we'll go through and then we'll start configuring our label configuration as part of Defender for Cloud Apps. Let's head across there now. All right, so we're now here in the policy management view. This one's the place where we're going to go through and configure various Defender for Cloud Apps policies as required. But the one we're specifically looking to leverage is a file-based policy. This will allow us to use the different labeling structures as part of Defender for Cloud Apps ecosystem and essentially enforce them based on particular types of info we find. There are some policy templates you can utilize. Feel free to use those if they match the scenario you're looking for, but we're going to create a custom one. Now, the file policy we're specifically interested in is that if a file is ever shared externally, we want to ensure that the right severity level is located, in our case low, but that we're able to give a clear understanding of why this file was matched and apply the correct solution accordingly. We'll change that severity to high because I've had a thought. If this is going to be primarily for highly confidential files, we might want to add a bit of extra nuance and maybe a warning here to say that something has come through. Note I've got this currently configured for just external access, so we only want to trigger this for that one scenario. You'll find this sort of nuanced adjustment is something you get quite used to. You'll create something which is designed as a low or medium confidence, but then by making it more specific, we can actually have a higher level of confidence potential, a higher level of severity applied. Now, in terms of the actions that I want to apply here, all I want to do is simply go through and ensure that we apply the right sensitivity labels. I'll hit that apply sensitivity labels, and then I will go through and pick the one that is most appropriate. And in our scenario, this is going to be the highly confidential specified people label. This will ensure that a user will essentially have to sign in to verify that they are the user authorized to receive this file once it goes on the other end. This gives us about as tight a control as we can possibly ask as we go through and share files with other organizations and external users. It is possible to also enforce a complete override of any user-defined labels that have been applied to the file and effectively reclassify it with this label specifically if that is appropriate. So now, because we have scoped this down to just external users, we can essentially say that if it leaves the organization, it is now considered highly confidential, and we can ensure it's got the correct marking and restrictions in place so only the right people are able to see it. Okay, now that we've got our sensitivity labels in place, we should actually start in using them for enforcement. Sensitivity labels go beyond just the ability to essentially control where something is from a classification standpoint and instead give us a mechanism to say, if something is a certain sensitivity label, then do X. We can use this as a way to enforce controls around where things should and shouldn't be. We can ensure that things are consistently managed when it comes to data protection. And we can also use this to apply to things that you might not think of immediately. Meetings, Teams messages, even interactions with Copilot through Microsoft 365. Let's go through and talk a little bit about how sensitivity labels are actually rolling out in the environment itself. As a starting point, the labels themselves are designed as a way to manage beyond just data. It's not just files and emails, data, it's chat interactions, it's meetings, it's all of those things. So when you create a label, you're essentially creating a single category that you can use to identify where something needs to be enforced. Some sort of consistent or persistent protection. Now, within the Office 365 suite, think your Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, we tend to focus on encryption, watermarks, those sorts of controls. They can be enforced as part of the sensitivity label structure. But this can also be used for Microsoft 365 groups, so only people who have a managed device can be a member of a specific group. Within SharePoint, we can configure labels to be applied across a broad piece of the SharePoint library. Even in OneDrive, we can apply controls around where things should or should not be available. Ultimately, if you design your labels well, we're able to have much better data security boundaries, clear boundaries about where sensitive information can and cannot be accessed, and we can control the access over who should be able to see that much easier without having to go down to the specifics of individual files, more focused on the broad strokes using that sensitivity classification. Of course, compliance is a key component of this as well, and many different compliance offerings require and leverage these sensitivity labels to work in that space. Now, end users tend to know sensitivity labels from how they integrate into the Office suite, so we should probably start there. Office applications, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, these sorts of ones, typically have a little drop down at the top that allow you to see that a label has been applied, and then we can change the sensitivity through that structure that is available in the menu. Standalone Office applications don't support built-in labeling. Think the ones that are completely offline. So we typically see this mostly in the online version of Office and within the Microsoft 365 subscriber version of Office. This is what most enterprises are using. The other caveat is that if you are using older file formats, .doc, .xls, .ppt, things without the X at the end, we're not going to be able to apply these labels in quite the same way. Just do keep this in mind as you roll them out. Now, what users can do with this, that's probably the more pertinent thing here. The main pieces are the ability to change labels whilst editing. So if a user identifies that a file has been miscategorized or your default posture for what a default label looks like is too high or too low, the user can recategorize that automatically just by selecting it and dropping it, getting it from the dropdown. You can ask them to provide justification or you can just allow it. It all depends on the scenario. And of course, this also allows for that enforcement of any visual language that we put in place. So if we are putting additional encryption or certain visual markings on the document, we can enforce that via the label structure. But it doesn't have to be just the Office suite. Certainly, whilst this is the most visible for end users, we can look beyond. If you are utilizing the Defender for Cloud Apps ecosystem, sensitivity labels can extend well beyond just the Microsoft ecosystem. Essentially, Defender for Cloud Apps, because of the way it functions, gives you the ability to see sensitive content as it moves throughout other cloud platforms. So from this, we can start to apply additional controls and structures to certain applications. Let's say you're integrating with a third-party app, and you want to be able to ensure that data that flows into this app never exceeds a sensitive level. We don't want any internal components or anything that is highly confidential here. What we can do is apply a Defender for Cloud Apps policy and integrate in with things like the browser extension capabilities or within the endpoint capabilities that we have within Defender for Cloud Apps and start to look for real-time enforcement. As files or pieces of sensitive information move around, we can apply labels and then change the enforcement based on the label that we need to apply. This gives us a really easy way to be able to just control this from a central governance perspective, and that's really important. You can utilize this for a range of different pieces, but one of the common ones we're seeing now is generative AI applications. If you're using a ChatGPT of the world or some custom third-party generative AI solution for chat, it can be important to ensure that controls are enforced and you've got the protections you need. And Defender for Cloud Apps offers a mechanism to potentially kind of leverage those things and protect. Now, if you're working with Microsoft 365 Copilot, the story is a little bit different. Mostly because many of those protections and integrations don't require a secondary solution. They're integrated natively. Out of the box, Microsoft 365 Copilot has the ability to integrate with your sensitivity labels, and you actually get to control what level of sensitivity you wish to engage with M365 Copilot. On top of that, your data security more broadly is maintained. So If something comes in as a highly confidential file, now the entire chat, that whole conversation that's been had with M365 Copilot is marked at the same level. This automated inheritance component is strictly important, especially because when we drag in source content, we want to ensure that that is captured accordingly. Now, it goes beyond this as well. Because Copilot can only ever see what an end user sees, we use their permission structure. This is effectively a double enforcement to ensure that when generated content is put out, we can apply the right restrictions to it. From a compliance perspective, there is still all the same things that you require, though. We have the ability to maintain encryption and access restrictions, even when we're using AI, just to ensure that we meet the compliance requirements we need. Now, I do want to talk meetings. They're a little bit unusual in that we don't tend to think about classifying meetings in quite the same way we do a document or an email. At least most enterprises I've worked with don't. But there are a lot of controls that you can actually enforce at certain sensitivity labels. Let's say, for example, that if a meeting is a highly confidential meeting or above, you have a mandate that that meeting must be recorded. You can actually enforce that via a label. We have a number of other controls here, such as the ability to bypass the lobby. You can actually control whether people can or cannot bypass the lobby. Even if you want to prevent people from joining in via that lobby, you can do that. Right down to restricting who is allowed in an attendee versus a presenter role, and where the recording can be disabled. All of this can be put in place as part of the sensitivity label structure. Now, there are some other pieces of interesting components we can put here. One of the ones I like that often gets kind of an undersung hero is the ability to watermark shared content. So when someone shares a screen, we can place a watermark over the top to ensure that there is still a consistency around when things are being shared and the classification accordingly. There's a lot of really interesting things that we can enforce via a sensitivity label when it comes to a meeting, and it might not be everyone's first thought, but a great place to think about. Now, this word containers has a number of different meanings within the IT space, but I want to be clear that this is specifically focused on the Microsoft 365 container ecosystem. Container level support are used for Teams, for M365 groups, for SharePoint environments, and it's focused on a combination of access, sharing, privacy, take your pick. There's a number of different things that we will want to control in this space, but primarily it's focusing on consistent workspace settings. So as we go through and we want to put restrictions, say a site owner wants to say that only certain people can access this particular SharePoint site, anything that's within that container can have a consistent approach to it. This is especially good where we do have certain encryption or marking requirements, and it allows us to essentially say, if something ends up in this container, then we must apply this label. It's a different approach than going through and using an auto classification methodology or using some other sort of user intervention, and gives us just another option that's available to us there. All right, as a last sort of thought, this is just a quick summary of some of the different ways in which we can enforce labels and some of the ways in which we might need to think about it. As a starting point, Outlook. Outlook gives you that ability to apply labels directly to email communication. Makes sense, it's what we do. Beyond this, Teams has the ability to apply labels within the admin center, so essentially we can inherit Teams label settings across an environment. So if you need to mark an entire Teams environment at a certain label or subsets of it at higher labels because they may be sensitive projects, you can do that. SharePoint is focused at site level. So this is where we go a site level setting to be able to adjust broad label components. And within groups, we can also create labels within the Microsoft 365 group ecosystem. This allows you to control who's allowed to join the group, whether you can share files outside of the group, or if anyone's allowed to invite guests in. There's a number of different places that we would want to look at, but ultimately, you have control and a lot of different places that these labels can reach. Coming up with a consistent label structure, a consistent label plan, and all of the various points that you need to hit means that we can actually go through and apply those labels in many, many locations. and that goes beyond just the cloud. Labels are able to stretch into an on-premises environment, and we have classification and protection systems to help you be able to identify the right classification for your data, even if it is not located in the Microsoft Cloud or in a third-party cloud provider. We're going to talk about how the information protection scanner actually functions. This will be the primary mechanism we use to be able to work and look across our environment. We'll talk about how discovery scans function, and I'll give you a little bit of a tour on the application of sensitivity labels within this context. It's a little bit of a different process compared to the cloud, but ultimately the broad strokes are the same. We're still trying to find our data, identify where it is, and make sure that we can categorize it so we can apply the correct enforcement. Now, the information protection scanner is designed as a way to look across file shares and on-premises SharePoint server sites and be able to identify certain types of information that are across everything there. What it means is that we can have a more consistent approach, even in a hybrid environment where, despite the fact that we're not in a built-in cloud protection space, we can still provide some of the same information protection platform advantages to those on-premises locations. Now, it is pretty common, especially in large enterprises that have been around for a while, that not everything will be in the cloud immediately. This effectively gives us that ability to reach back on premises and be able to identify those sources. It is designed primarily to scan Windows file servers, and then we'll apply classifications and protections to those files accordingly using the Purview policies you put in place. Just remember that as you are rolling this out, it's not everything in the world that's supported. Must be an SMB file share, needs to be on a modern SharePoint server, and we can also do NAS and SAN-based storage as long as you map it to an SMB. The main thing to focus on is rolling out a policy configuration that is consistent and will work for what you need. If you can focus on that, the preparation of your environment is relatively straightforward. Here's just a broad architectural map, but we can see, if I just zoom in a bit here, in the center we have the scanner server cluster. This cluster itself is the core engine that actually performs the scans across our environment. Now, this doesn't have to be on a single Windows server, but often can be put on multiple if we have a large amount of data to scan. The Purview compliance stack is where we're actually going to then go through and target certain policies and monitor the results as they come back. We have a number of different places we can target: SharePoint servers, NAS storage, and file shares. And as long as SMB or SharePoint is used, we've got our mechanism to put it. But you will also require a SQL server just to ensure that we've got a mechanism to actually store the information that we gather. With all of these pieces in play, though, we just need to go through and install the scanner itself on that cluster, and then we can use that to start actually going through and deploying it out. There are 5 key steps to being able to actually get this configured, deployed, and run. First, we need to create a cluster. This is done through the Microsoft Purview portal. That cluster can then run scan jobs. So we create a cluster, then we run the installer on our Windows Server cluster. We then do an authentication layer. This makes sure that under the standard sort of Zero Trust model that you do have permissions to be able to run something like this, generate the sensitive data. Then we enable classification and protection, effectively provide what sensitivity labels we actually wish to scan in our environment. This is going to be used in conjunction with our sensitive information types to be able to automatically identify certain types of info. And last of all, when you actually run the scan, we start in discovery mode, and then you can enable automatic protection as required. Always start with that discovery scan. We need to make sure that we can identify where certain files are located and inventory them. This is the same problem statement that we've always been facing. Where and how do I actually identify my information? This is your starting point. Once we've got this, an output will be available to you, and that'll help you match the results to ensure that we can find all of the pieces of the information together. And the management itself, pretty straightforward. You run your discovery scan to identify the files. That's number 1. Then we provide the classification against the scans themselves, essentially say what we found and you confirm that we found the right information and identified it accordingly. And then we go through and we can review the progress over time. We can pause if there's any impact that we need to pause it for. Think of this as a way of reducing business impact and reducing noise on a server that is potentially busy. And then if we need to, we can rescan once we update our policies accordingly. This is designed to just help you stretch. And so make sure you're keeping an eye on how things are actually running. There is some clear best practice about how we should be using this. And one of the big ones is making sure that we schedule our scans during off hours. There is good reason why we have the ability to pause and resume jobs. If you don't schedule things accordingly, you may need to pause it to come back later because it will do quite a number of hits on a file share or a server to try and identify what's there. Make sure you're going through and checking the error logs because this will show things where there's file lock conflicts or access denied errors, things that may be unexpected. And of course, you really should make sure at the get-go that your scanner has read and write permissions to that environment. Read to be able to do the discovery scan and write to be able to write the metadata accordingly. All right, with all of that in play, we are now into the final stretch to talk about encryption. Now, there's a few different places we can apply encryption in Microsoft 365 via Purview. So I want to first start with just M365 broadly. There's a few important pieces of the puzzle to think about when we are working with Microsoft 365 data, whether it's at rest or in transit. So we'll talk about what it does, the different layers of encryption that are there, and I'll talk a little bit more about Azure Rights Management. I've touched on it a little bit, but there's more to it than just getting yourself up and running. Let's get ourselves started. Now, Microsoft 365 has three primary mechanisms to apply encryption, and most of these are done by default. You effectively don't need to do anything else beyond just the setup of the platform. At rest, we encrypt your files and your data across SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, take your pick. But this uses platform-managed keys with an optional ability for you to provide your own key. This is important because when data is encoded using a platform-managed key, if it were to be stolen, effectively it would be protected on the storage medium itself. But there are some scenarios where we need to apply a secondary layer of encryption that you control. This means that if you revoke the key or you take the key away, the data itself could not be read even if it was retrieved directly. It's essentially just a secondary check beyond the protection at the storage layer. On top of this, data in transit can be secured. Think TLS encryption across a network. Email transfers, file transfers, Teams chat, these sorts of pieces of information need to be encrypted just as the nature of the internet. It's the only way that you can use your device securely, no matter whether you are on general Wi-Fi, etc. We have a consistent in-transit system to be able to have that sort of protection. But of course, we can also situationally apply additional controls around encryption. Identity-based access is an interesting one because we can actually add Azure Rights Management controls to prevent viewing and forwarding and printing of files through a secondary layer of encryption. This gives us a persistent mechanism to ensure that even if a file is shared outside of an organization, we can still have that same protection applied. Now, the encryption itself really does come in three key layers. Azure RMS is where we have that identity base, and you should consider this the outermost layer. It's an easy way for us to be able to use platform-managed keys to ensure that when a file is shared, it only gets encrypted at the moment that we can verify someone should be able to utilize it. The service encryption itself sits as a baseline, so consider that the underlying structure. This gives us the easy way to be able to identify that ultimately we are doing our job as a service provider. And then that customer key gives you the third layer, and that's the optional one, where you have stronger regulatory and or governance controls and you require it, you can add that in place. But do keep in mind that it does take additional setup. I'll show you in the demonstration a little bit of how that works. Now, encryption can be applied certainly in many different ways, but one of the more common ways that we tend to encounter it is via email. If you've ever received an email that has had encryption applied to it, you'll know what this looks like. You will receive something that looks like a protected message. It will say that accordingly, and it won't let you unlock that to be able to see it until you have proven your identity layer. This is the email encryption standard, and it's a fairly common approach that we can take where we need to ensure that an email that leaves our org only goes to certain recipients or certain authorized peoples. Essentially, we can enforce usage rights beyond our own tenant. There are many different types of collaboration and communication that don't allow for that. Instead, we need to invite people into our space. But this is one example where we can stretch outside of just what we can achieve in our stack. Now, if we actually want to utilize message encryption in this email format, this is not just a set and forget. There is actually quite a number of steps we need to take to ensure that it works well. We will need to go across and take a look at some of the pieces over in Exchange to be able to get this set up. We're going to need something called a mail flow rule if we want to apply this encryption automatically. On top of that, there's actually quite a bit of customization we can do. I'll show you a little bit in a demonstration, but we should take a look at the different options that are there, standard versus advanced message encryption, and some of the different things we can put around revocation to ensure that if an email is not opened in a sufficient period of time, we can essentially automatically prevent people from continuing to open that email. Let's get started. When we look to prevent the opening of emails in certain scenarios via encryption, we use Azure Rights Management. Azure RMS has come up over and over again, but the thing that we haven't talked about yet is the mail flow setup. There are many scenarios where you want to automatically encrypt emails that are headed to certain organizations or headed out to public infrastructure. So you can use this as a way to say, if something is classified at a certain level, whilst yes, I will allow you to send it outside of the organization, someone is going to need to pass a check to be able to open it up. There are three kind of fairly common encryption options, and some of them you may not have even identified that they're using encryption to achieve this. Encrypt only allows you to essentially encrypt the message, but we can still do forwarding, copying, printing. Essentially, it's just the message requires authentication so we know who is opening it. But this could also come in the place of a do not forward. If you've ever received an email in your inbox with a thing that says, do not forward, this email cannot be forwarded to other people, that's actually being done via the encryption settings. That's a really useful one for things like executive briefs or for publications within an organization or something that needs to be shared widely, but then shouldn't be on-shared outside of that initial scope. And of course, rights management still comes into play, ties very heavily into that Azure component and the ability for us to enforce who should be able to open something when. These are some of the common things that we tend to run into. Now, to actually get ourselves set up, a lot of the work is still done via PowerShell here. Not exclusively, but Exchange and much of the configuration there is done in that stack. To verify that it's active, we need to just go through them and double check that, well, essentially that we've done our rights management setup to get ourselves going. Easiest way to do that is to use the get IRM configuration PowerShell commandlet. If needed, you can then enable it using the test component to make sure that it's working in space there. Once we've got this in place and we've got our tenant all set up, the next thing will be those mail flow rules. If we have an automated environment that we wish to apply certain types of encryption to, so if an email contains confidential in it, we should apply the confidential label. That's the sort of thing that we can put in place. In fact, this is one of the interesting ones. As much as this is a video series focused on Purview, this is one place where we'll actually be working either with or alongside our Exchange admins to ensure that we've got the right actions in place and everything is making sense. Now, once we actually choose to implement something automatically, the mail flow rules are essentially the way that we will achieve this. We can trigger it based on certain types of sensitive information. That's our sensitive information types like strings, words, keywords, things like that. We can ensure that the mail flow rule will catch this as it passes through, all done through the Exchange Admin Center. And then if we need to apply any other components, there is still some PowerShell commandlets. For example, encryption is done via the new transport rule. That's a PowerShell commandlet to do exactly that. create new transport rules where we can set the IRM configuration. Within that encryption option, there is the different places: encrypt only, do not forward, various IRM options. There's many different things that you can configure within this, but make sure that you are testing this accordingly. Just remember that this will go through and you can just use sensitivity labels alone to enforce encryption, but the most flexibility and the most kind of coverage is going to come from working out how we automate this. Think and touch on the most sensitive topics first and your highest levels of classification before you then go into other scenarios. Now, I'll show you a bit more of an example of how you can customize it, but this is the sort of example message that you'll receive. If you've never received an encrypted message before, you may not have seen this one. This is an example where we have a message from Lynn that is being sent to someone via the finance department. If you want to read that message, you have to click the button, read the message. There's an access to this message is available for a certain amount of time, and we can put that in place. Most of this can be configured. We can have a brand identity so people know that it is definitely coming from a trusted organization. We can have individual pieces of user-facing text that you can fully customize. What's in the introduction? What is the actual thing that is on the read button that you see in the middle? Even down to the email that we see down the bottom, the copy that we see there. Right down to where we publish things like the mail expiry, where we publish things like our privacy URL. We can put all of this information in and customize what shows where in a template to make sure that the right people kind of know and can feel comfortable that this is coming from a legitimate source. Now, with all of this said, most of the encryption will be handled in the scenarios we've said so far. But there is also a couple of other things that we can put in the advanced message encryption. Think of these as additional tweaks that you can apply beyond just traditional mail flow rules. So, number one, expiration. If you want to make sure that something only lasts a short period of time, you can apply an expiration to it. This email is valid for a week or a month, whatever it is you need to put in place. We can also enable revocation. Expiration and revocation are slightly different in that expiration will happen naturally over time, but revocation can happen at any time where someone needs to go through and remove an email's access. Really useful for an administrator that needs to remove access broadly to a previously sent image. Custom branding can obviously be applied to that, so we can use this as a way to combine the two, combine the messaging and say this email could be revoked at any time. We also have the ability to track access. In fact, this is one of the best reasons to use this in this sort of encryption tracking. It allows us to see exactly who has opened that email when. And if it's important that someone opens it within a certain time frame, or we need to absolutely verify for compliance reasons that an important document was received, well, now we've got an audit trail. It's an important piece to consider because sometimes it's not about the encryption itself, it's about the audit trail that we generate because of the way that encryption needs to be unlocked. If you do have strict governance requirements, there are great reasons to use this. And because we can apply it automatically using those mail flow rules, there's lots of different advantages in terms of that automated procedure we can follow. Now we're going to jump into a quick demonstration to just show off a couple of pieces here. Mostly we're going to take a look at how we can do a little bit of custom branding work ourselves. I'll show you the end-to-end, as well as how we can actually apply this encryption using a mail flow rule for the finance team, same as the scenario I just showed you. Let's jump in. All right, time for a bit of change of pace. We're actually over in the Exchange admin portal, available at admin.exchange.microsoft.com. What we're going to do is create a mail flow rule, which will allow us to essentially auto-classify information as it passes through certain scenarios. Now, the goal that we have here is the ability to add encryption and rights protection as information leaves the financial part of our organization. So, a sensitive location. We need to go through and define a few different conditions in order for this mail flow rule to trigger in the right way. And the thing we're interested in is the application of Office 365 message encryption. So, as always, we give things a name, just so we can easily identify them later. And then we need to add some conditions as to when this will trigger. Perfect. So if the sender is part of our finance organization, that's the critical thing that we're looking for, we then need to go through and modify that message encryption accordingly. Now, you could put certain exemptions in here, and that can be useful if you need to. But we've essentially got everything we need in place. What we will also put in place is one of our templates. Of course, a template is required, so let's go through and ensure that we say what particular label we wish to essentially apply. We're going to put this in an encrypt label, which feels counterintuitive, but is available where you don't necessarily want to apply a different type of sensitivity label to something. We'll select our RMS label there as encrypt to ensure that the data is encrypted as it leaves. Now, an RMS template is essentially a rights management template. We use this to be able to work within a predefined structure. You can create custom ones as well if there's something in particular you need to put in place. Now, from here, there is a number of different settings we can put in. We recommend running a test initially, but there are some scenarios where you'll want to enforce directly. We can set things like severity for potential alerts, so if this does match, what occurs next. And we can also make certain adjustments in terms of the rule structure if we need to. One thing that is important to put in place, though, is some sort of easy disclaimer, effectively what it is that we're actually doing here. So we'll go through and we'll add a quick little disclaimer to our piece here. This essentially goes through and adds a little notification to say, hey, this has happened. We want to make sure that you understand that this is real, and this unusual looking message that you may not have encountered before, we can essentially append a simple disclaimer to the text there. So we'll do that. This email has been encrypted and sent securely by Contoso. Gives us an easy way to identify. We can also choose a fallback action. So if for whatever reason that disclaimer cannot be seen, we've got a mechanism to put it in place. And in this case, we wrap the message to effectively say, hey, this needs to have a separate login to be able to view it. Now that we've got these pieces in play, we've essentially got everything else we need. So we can hit review and finish and implement the mail flow rule from there. All right, and we're saved successfully. Always test with an external mailbox any rules that you wish to apply. So make sure that if encryption is important for the scenario you're looking to achieve, that you do apply an active test just to make sure that everything's working as intended. In this video, we covered a lot of ground, but ultimately it was focused on two key areas: sensitivity labels and encryption. There is certainly flow between these, but I hope this has given you an understanding of the different ways in which we can apply encryption, the different ways in which we can apply labels, and how labels can inform different encryption practices across the Microsoft 365 stack and beyond. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.